So I'm going to do some quick introductions. These are going to be briefer because we have 3 speakers, but I still want to introduce them all the same. So Rhonda, you all know, is the Harold W. Tribble Professor of Psychology and Senior Research Fellow at the Program for Leadership and Character at Wake Forest. His research focuses on well-being, moral psychology, growth following adversity, wisdom, and integrative theories of personality, and he's worked with populations in Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and the U.S. His many awards include a Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science, Wake Forest Award for Excellence in Research, a Mellon Refugee Initiative Fund Fellowship, and grants from a number of different granting organizations. Mike here to my left is a professor of psychology and Wright Faculty Fellow at Wake Forest University. His substantive research includes person-situation interactions and people's perceptions of themselves and their social worlds, particularly with regard to morality. His methodological interests include psychological measurement and statistical methods. His many papers have appeared in such places as Psychological Science, Journal of Personality, and Social Psychology and Psychological Methods. And he's also authored 2 books, one of which is Psychometrics and Introduction with Sage. And then Caleb, down here in the front here, is a postdoctoral research fellow on the Honesty Project at, take a guess, Wake Forest University, and an adjunct professor at Willamette University, where he will teach full-time in the coming academic year. His primary research interests are moral psychology and its intersections with the psychology of religion. He has a particular interest in psychological measurement of socially loaded constructs such as moral judgments, moral character, and religiosity. With this project, he's working on issues including lay conceptions of honesty, how to get around social desirability and self-reports of honesty, and how to best estimate the prevalence of dishonest behaviors people are loath to admit. So please join me in thanking, not yet.
We're done.
Welcoming first.
Well, thank you, Christian, and thanks to everyone for being here and coming back. I hope you've enjoyed the conference yesterday, and so far today we'll hopefully keep that good stuff rolling here. What we're going to do, what Aranda and Caleb and I are going to do, is to build on some of the work that we started talking about last year. Last year we were talking about assessing what we're calling truthful communications. We kind of laid the groundwork for what we're doing and why we're doing that and what we meant by that. This year, my goal is to give you a quick refresher of what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then we'll move to Aranda, who's going to talk about some of the work we've done on measuring truthful communication at the trait or person level and build on new work that's been done since last year. And then Caleb's going to take over and talk about completely new work done this year, looking at measuring truthful communication at the state level. So that's our game plan for today. I want to first acknowledge and thank the team that has been involved with this for the last 2 or 3 years, including our project managers, including Peyton, who's over there, and graduate students, Chillin and Ben, who are over there. Without them and the support from the John Templeton Foundation, obviously we would not be here today. So thanks to all of them. So again, our team here at Wake Forest, we've been doing a lot of things with regard to the Honesty Project and different issues in studying honesty. But for today, what we want to do is to talk about the direction of work we're doing with regard to measurement. So our goal for this work is to help advance research on honesty in daily life by developing trait and state measures of this truthful communication idea, measures that are hopefully conceptually well-grounded and psychometrically sound. That's our ambitious goal there. We'll see how we do. So these are the topics we're going to talk about. First, again, what is this idea of honesty in daily life? Why are we focusing on that? What do we mean by truthful communication, or why this idea of truthful communication? And then our measures of a character trait and character state. So that's our game plan. So what do we mean by honesty in daily life, and why do we care about that? Well, what we mean by studying honesty in daily life is to try to understand how honesty plays out in the real world life experiences, the real world dilemmas we face, the real world relationships we have, the real world, difficult conversations that we have on a day-to-day hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute basis, that can challenge our honesty. This is important, obviously, because this is where honesty really hits real life. This is where the implications of honesty really happen in the daily life experiences. So that's why we're interested in this. I think this is interesting also in part because it complements the in-lab research that a lot of people in social psychology, behavioral economics have done, including some of the great researchers here. So I think it does a nice job of complementing that rigorous in-lab experimental research. From a psychological perspective, I think this is particularly interesting because understanding honesty and how it plays out in daily life requires understanding honesty at both a person level, right? So some people, we assume at least, some people are more honest than others in general or tend to be more honest than others. And Bill Chopik yesterday talked about a person level, think about honesty as a personality trait. So it requires that. But it also requires thinking about honesty as a personality state. And obviously any of us, or if you're like me, you're maybe more honest in some situations than in others. So even within a person, honesty can vary from one situation or state to another. So if we want to understand this, we have to understand honesty from both levels, person level and state level. And if we want to do that empirically, we have to measure honesty at both a person level and state level. So that's what we're focusing on, and that's some of the opportunities or challenges that it entails. As I mentioned, we're focusing on what we're calling truthful communication. So where does that come from and why are we doing that? So honesty, as we all know, can encompass a broad range of different phenomena, cheating, stealing, and so on. Now, these are not the same thing, obviously. You can cheat without lying and steal without cheating or whatever. So these are not the same thing. But we want to study honesty and things relevant to honesty. So what we wanted to do was to empirically focus on things that we thought were interesting, but also things that might resonate most deeply with the average person out there. Like, what do most people think of and what do most people care about when they think of honesty? Is it one of these things? Do they think about all these things kind of equally? Is there any one thing that does kind of rise to the top as being kind of at the heart of honesty? I mentioned this last year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it now. But across a set of studies we've done over the last 2 or 3 years, we have 4 or 5 studies now, combining both qualitative and quantitative methods. We've had hundreds of participants generate thousands of examples of honest character traits, honest behaviors, and so on. And we've had people rate the themes that have emerged from those examples. They've rated those themes in terms of, well, how central is this to honesty? How prototypical or how definitive of this is this of honesty? And without kind of forcing you to listen to too much of the description, which I'll be glad to do if you are interested, but across all of these studies, it was pretty clear. There's 2 or 3 things that became clear. One is that, yeah, when people think of honesty, a lot of things come up. Cheating, stealing, and so on. Those things come up. That's not surprising. Another point was that, but one thing seems to dominate in people's conceptualization of honesty, and that one thing is truthfulness, right? So if you ask the average person, what do you think honesty is? Basically, they go to truthfulness first. It is the most frequently occurring example. Examples having to do with truthfulness are the most frequently occurring examples. And examples related to truthfulness are seen as most definitive of honesty or the best examples of honesty, not by us, by our participants. So when people think of honesty, they tend to think of truthfulness in some way or another. So that's what we want to study. That's our purpose. With a lot of the work that we've done, both what we're talking about here and in some of the other directions of work that we've taken here at Wake. And so if we want to study honesty or truthfulness specifically, then we need to, again, measure that somehow. So that led us to think of, well, what is the current state of the field in terms of measurement of this characteristic that people seem to view as the heart of honesty? And again, even based on our conversation with Taya's work and Alan, your point, where's that? Alan's point about Taya's work, that was talking about, you were talking about honesty as a more general construct. We're talking here about truthfulness more specifically or narrowly. But the issue that Alan raised applies here, which is if you look at the existing measures of that you might consider being relevant to truthfulness measures ostensibly of honesty or integrity or authenticity, then in our opinion, if you look at the item content as Alan was doing, it doesn't look like truthfulness. I mean, it barely looks like honesty for some of these things. But it certainly does, it looks even less like truthfulness specifically. So at least in our eyes, all of the current measures that you would turn to lack content validity as representing truthfulness. So those aren't going to do us any good. Even among those, even getting past that, a lot of these measures have either unknown psychometric quality or poor psychometric quality, so they're not empirically very useful. So even setting the conceptual problem aside, empirically they're not going to help us. So this is a problem. Even more to Alan's point earlier, I'll do this real quickly. I'm setting this up because we're going to return to this in a little bit. But just as an example, don't take our word for the lack of content validity. We had some other people, we asked other people, what do you think? So for example, the Hexaco Honesty Humility Scale, which did come up earlier, is probably the most well-known personality inventory related to honesty. And we had participants, these were undergrads at Wake, participants read every single item on the Honesty Humility Scale and rate each item for the degree to which that item seemed to reflect truthfulness. Does this item have anything to do with truthfulness? Or rather, how much does this item seem to have something to do with truthfulness? And they also rated how well each item reflected truthfulness and some other constructs, like competing constructs, okay? And so based on those data, what we were able to do was create essentially scores for each scale on each of the subscales on the Hexaco, representing the degree to which it represented pure truthfulness, which we basically mean the degree to which each scale seems to, at least in terms of its content, reflect truthfulness more so than something else. Okay, because we want it to measure truthfulness, not something else. So we asked people to do that. We were able to get these scores. So these are the subscales: modesty, greed, fairness, sincerity. I think again you saw those on Taya's slides earlier, and the honesty, humility, total score. In the eyes of our judges, at least, every single one of these did a poor job at reflecting truthfulness better than something else. That is, or put another way, every one of these scales in the eyes of our judges reflected something else more so than truthfulness. Okay. So again, if you want to study truthfulness, great, but this isn't going to do it for you. You use this, you're not measuring truthfulness, or you're not measuring it precisely or clearly. That's a problem. Okay, so we want to study truthfulness. It seems to be at the heart of honesty, and even aside from whether it's the heart of honesty, it's probably something important to study. So that's what I want to study, but unfortunately there's seems to be no good existing measures of that. So that's where we came in. Again, part of the work that we're doing is try to develop measures that researchers can use to assess this construct precisely and well, and to hopefully learn something about this. So I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Rhonda, who's going to tell you something interesting.
Exactly, hopefully. We'll see. Yeah. Hello, everyone. So in this section, I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of the trait version of the Truthful Communication Scale. Now, I should tell you that we went through most of this material last year. There are a couple of new slides of information that I'll highlight, but for those of you who have perfect memory, you might find some of this stuff somewhat boring. But I did want to start with a rebuttal to a common refrain, right? When we talk about measuring honesty, which is that, oh, you're going to ask the liar whether they tell the truth. What is the liar going to do? Lie, right? So, and it's a reasonable point, right? So, if you're asking people to self-report on truthfulness or to self-report on honesty, are liars going to tell the truth? Probably not. So, a couple of points to make here. So, first of all, as personality psychologists, we acknowledge the fact that when you're assessing traits, you do it in a multi-method fashion, right? Those of you who know our work know that we've developed assessments of moral traits used in self-reports, informal reports, used in state assessments. So there's an acknowledgement that self-reports aren't going to get you 100% of the way there. But what they can do is give you distinctive information that other types of assessments may not be able to give you. So relatedly, what this means is that we're not saying that self-reports are the end-all and be-all. Similarly, we're not saying that self-reports have no value, right? So I just want to push back against what I think is a bit of a straw man argument, which is that self-reports are completely useless because they're by nature self-reports, right? Now, that said, I want to talk about some specific reasons why assessing self-reports of truthfulness is important. First of all, and this goes back to Mike's point, goes back to Alan's point, there are a lot of measures that ostensibly assess honesty, but don't in fact capture the core characteristics of honesty, right? Honesty, humility is a perfect example. Will has written about how honesty, humility is better labeled as benevolence. Mark Leary has written about how low levels of honesty or humility are best labeled as selfishness, right? So it's clear that the content of honesty and humility isn't really capturing the core of honesty. Second of all, you could argue that in order to know whether someone's honest, you need to track their behavior, observe them for multiple days, get a sense of how they tell the truth or lie to different friends in different contexts. But it's also true that practically speaking, there are many reasons why we want to gain information about someone's level of honesty in an efficient manner. Right? Many of the studies that have been presented here today need efficient measures of honesty that have validity. Right? So with the goal of getting efficient information that's also valid, a self-report approach is a good way to do it. Third of all, going back to my point of how self-report measures can provide distinctive information that may be hard to glean otherwise. If you want to know about someone's motivation, if you want to know about someone's emotional experience when they're telling the truth or lying, if you want to know about their concerns, maybe in a situation where they don't want to lie to someone because they fear the repercussions, the best way to get that information is to ask people. And arguably, it's not clear that other types of assessments are going to give you the same quality of information. Now, it's also true that in principle, people might lie on a survey because they want to signal the fact they're a good person, right? So I want to signal the fact that I'm a good person. So if you tell me to report my responses in a measure to all of you, I'm probably going to give a certain point, I'm going to rate high on everything, right? So if that's true, then in principle, if people are given the opportunity to take this survey in an anonymized setting where they know that their data is not going to be linked to their name or to identifiable information, you would expect levels of that type of responding to go down. I should also mention that our measure is designed to be used for both self-reports and informant reports. Now, while all the data we'll be presenting here is our data looking at self-reports of truthful communication, we already have data looking at informant reports, where people who know targets well provide information on how truthful they think that person is. Right? So the measure that we're discussing here is a measure that can be used for both informant reports as well as self-reports. And finally, there is some evidence that people agree on target self-reports of honesty. So this is from data that we collected from the Character Project, which is a grant that we all did together maybe 10 years ago, a long time ago, when I was younger. And we used a different, more face-value measure of honesty, but we found moderate levels of self-other agreement, right? So this is all to say that there are good reasons, there are valid reasons for collecting self-reports of honesty. Okay, so when you're developing a scale, what are some of the important psychometric issues you need to pay attention to? For one, you want to have a good assessment that captures what you think are the core psychological elements of that construct. So, for example, you might think that in order to know whether someone's honest, you want to have a sense of what their emotional beliefs are, what their emotions are, what their beliefs about being honest or dishonest are, what their motivations are, right? Do they care about being honest because they care about the truth? So when you're thinking about the items to put into a measure, you want to be clear about what different components you want to assess. You want to have adequate breadth of those components, and you want to examine how those components relate to each other. So thinking about the internal structure is important. You also want the measure to be reliable. So to the extent to which you think honesty or truthful communication is a quality of a person, you would expect some degree of consistency. So if I took this measure today and I took it again in 1 week, you'd expect what we call the test-retest reliability to be pretty high. How many of you know about or have taken the Myers-Briggs personality inventory? OK, it has terrible reliability, so don't take it. Finally, you want to know whether the measure that you created is actually capturing the core of the construct you're interested in. So, for example, the honesty humility scale definitely has very high reliability, at least the long version of it does. But it likely doesn't have good validity, right? Because it's not capturing the core of what we think honesty is. So there are two ways of thinking about construct validity. You want to be sure that the core of your assessment is capturing what you think the core features are of the trait, but also you want to see whether that measure behaves in the way you expect it to. In other words, you want to see that it correlates with measures you expect it to be correlated with, both positively and negatively. And you also want to be uncorrelated with measures that you wouldn't expect a theoretical correlation with. Right? So these are some of the issues that we work through as we're developing this measure. So this is the definition of truthful communication that guided our research. So truthful communication is a tendency towards expressing one's belief accurately and faithfully. So we have a lot of information here. One thing I want to point out about this definition, though, is that we highlight the fact that people behind truthful communication are motivated to tell the truth even in context where it's hard. And we make that explicit because the items on the scale explicitly tap into that, right? We have questions about how even when it might be hard, I care about telling the truth, right? So that element was a core feature of our definition. Okay, so what are the psychological components of truthful communication that we captured in this measure? We included an evaluative component, or the belief that it's good and correct to communicate truthfully, an affective component. So the idea is that if you don't communicate truthfully, you're going to have experience feelings of guilt or shame, right? This is very similar to Thea's measure. A motivational component, so being motivated to tell the truth to other people, or being motivated to share what you think the truth is to other people, and a behavioral component, right? So actually being truthful. And so we went into this in great detail last year. We developed a pool of 148 items. We whittled it down to 75. Mike created this really cool instructional video that gave 10 coders instructions on how to rate the centrality of these items according to the definition. We whittled it down. And then we came up with a 15-item measure that all loaded onto one factor, right? So it all captures the core of truthful communication, but also there are 5 highly correlated, or what I would call subtle factors, right? That capture behaviors, positive behaviors, negative behaviors, the evaluative component, the affective component, and the motivational component. So we're pretty happy that this measure captures an adequate breadth of what we think are the key psychological components of truthful communication. We also found that this measure had a high level of reliability. So what do we call, and the single factor model, the alpha for the single factor model was 0.89. Okay. We then examined the convergence and discriminability of this measure. Now, here we used a quantifying construct validity approach. Now, you could, if I asked you to make predictions about how this measure would function, you'd probably say, oh yeah, it would correlate positively with some virtues, it'll probably correlate moderately or somewhat moderately with honesty and humility, it'll be negatively correlated with measures like the dark triad, right? Now, one challenge here is that if you don't theorize beforehand and make predictions beforehand about what you expect, you can sort of post hoc justify anything, right? You find a sort of correlation that this is roughly in line with what I expected. So what we did is that we had 6 members of our team make predictions about the specific correlations we would expect for each of these measures. The 6 coders had a pretty high level of agreement. So for the most part, the coders either were very wise or very unwise, depending on whether they were misaligned or not. But here are the predictions we made. So these are the averages of the predictions we made for the correlations between the truthful communication measure and all these measures. And these were the observed correlations. So it turns out that the correlation between our predicted relationships and our observed relationships was very high, 0.96. So we take this to be strong evidence of convergent discriminability. We also ran a day reconstruction study where we had participants break down their day, right, into different chunks, the different episodes, and then rated the extent to which they manifested honesty in each of the episodes. Now, it's a face-valid question, and we also give participants the option to say this situation wasn't relevant to honesty. And we found that people's trait truthful communication scores were moderately correlated with aggregated state scores. Or in other words, people's trait scores tracked their everyday behaviors, their everyday manifestations of honesty. Finally, just to return to the results from the study looking at the extent to which honest humility captures the core of truthfulness, we also had participants rate the items in the truthful communication scale. And good news, it turns out that participants who rated the items in the truthful communication scale agreed that the items on that measure captured the core of truthfulness, providing evidence for the content validity of the measure, at least compared to the 4 domains of honesty and humility. So, in summary, the trait version of the truthful communication scale is a reliable measure. All the items share a common core, but with these 5 more subtle factors present that capture a good range of psychological characteristics. We have good retest reliability for this measure, so it's consistent. We use a quantifying constructability procedure to show good evidence of convergent discriminability. And as I mentioned, despite the acknowledgement that self-reports are not perfect by themselves, we believe the truthful communication scale does capture important information. So, we're now going to talk a little bit about developing a version of the truthful communication scale that can be used to assess people's behavior in everyday life. And here, I turn the baton over to Caleb.
Thank you. All right, so Mike did a great job of setting up sort of the motivation to move from this trait scale to a state scale, right? So we've got a great trait scale. Surely the presentation should end here, right? Well, without adding this state component, without also building a measure that's designed to assess honesty in the daily life process, we're missing a lot of the important information about how honesty actually is lived out. So in the personality approach that we take here at Wake, we treat states as we treat traits as manifested in daily life in personality states. So traits don't exist in the world in this sort of like abstracted way, and that's how we live them out. They're lived out in the specific moments in which we manifest honesty to lower or higher degrees. Consequently, to get at measuring honesty, we have to look at truthfulness. We have to look at it at this day-to-day state level. This also affords us the opportunity to really understand what is pulling for more or less truthfulness as people go about their day-to-day life. In that personality states, as we treat truthfulness states, are seen as the result of the interplay of the goals that we have in our day-to-day life and the situational contingencies that we find ourselves in. It's this interplay of what we're trying to achieve and where we are in a moment that can help pull for a lot of how our traits are expressed. So to actually study these sorts of things and understand what are the situational contingencies, what are the goals that we're pursuing that pull for truthfulness, we need to be able to assess sort of in the moment type truthfulness. Because we're treating these states as a manifestation of this broader trait that we've done so much work on, there's a strong conceptual argument to assess these states kind of in parallel to the trait. And what I mean by that is that we did all this work with trait measure and all the psychological components. We could very easily walk over here and start pulling out items from a box and put together a state measure that looks like truthfulness. But we're interested in how this trait that we've spent a lot of time on over here plays out in day-to-day life. So we need the state measure that we're developing to draw upon that trait measure. It needs to be, what do the sorts of things that we assess here look like at a daily level, at a micro level. So it's important to adapt from that trait measure, particularly pulling the different psychological components that we think are an important part of truthfulness. These emotional components, these behavioral components, these motivational components. And another thing that we need to do in developing a state measure is that we need to develop a measure in a way that can be portable. So what I mean by that is we need to develop a state measure that isn't limited to the context that we validate it in. We need a measure that can assess truthfulness, say, in a conference setting, in a private individual conversation, when I'm trying to avoid blame, when I'm trying to explain things. We want a state measure that isn't developed only in one sort of communicative context. Doing that makes it a measure that is useful for more than just the purpose that it was built in that one case. So these were kind of the guiding principles for developing the state measure, were that we wanted to reflect the psychological content of this trait measure, and we wanted something that worked across a lot of different contexts. So the way that we did this, we started by choosing a bunch of contexts that we thought truthfulness could play out somewhat differently in. We chose a variety of things that we thought people experienced was relatively high frequency. They're somewhat general, and they seem to pull for perhaps different amounts of honesty. So you've got things like avoiding blame or getting out of something you don't want to do. Those might pull for a little, those might pull for more lying, more untruthfulness than something like explaining instructions to someone. So we've got this sort of breadth of situations, or these breadth of contexts that we're going to assess in to try and pull out a state measure that can assess across more than one sort of context. So we took the set of contexts, and we had participants recall a time recently that they were in each of these contexts. So we asked them, oh, have you experienced something like this recently? And rather than them just being able to say, yes, I did, moving on, we had them kind of stop and sit with it for a minute. So we had them do an event reconstruction procedure, which involves having them answer several factual questions about the particular situation that they experienced. So who were you with? When was this? How long ago? What time of day? Really jogging that episodic memory, getting them to think about and put themselves in the mind space that they were in the situation that we're asking them to tell us about. And from there, we had them complete a pool of state items. So we developed a set of, I think, I'm not going to guess the number. We had a large initial pool of state items that we all put together, looking at the trait measure, looking at its psychological components, and we kind of whittled that down, combined some into a pool of 20 initial items. And community participants from the Winston-Salem area responded to those contexts that I had before, rating each of these 20 state items. So we had a lot of different contexts and a bunch of items within each of those contexts, rating their most recent experience of that potentially truthful, relevant situation. From there, we used a series of factor analyses that looked both at the context in isolation, so what items capture truthfulness well within each of these, and then what items capture well across all of these. So pulling information from more than one context with that idea that we want a measure that is more general, right? So we used these factor analyses to reduce down from this pool of 20 items to a final set of 6 items that we thought did a good job of kind of carrying their weight in the factor analyses. So they brought information to the table and also maintained as much as we could the content coverage of these different psychological components, the affect, the emotion, or the affect, the motivation, etc. We ended up with 6 items, 2 each for behavior evaluation and motivation. But wait, you say that's not the same components you had up there. We didn't have any affective items that could hang with the rest of the scale. We had a lot of trouble with developing and then fitting the affective state items, and I'm happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. But we ended up dropping those from the state measure. So we have 6-item state measure has really good internal consistency and covers behavior evaluations and motivations. And just this quick example of what some of those look like. For an example of behavior item, you have 4 statements of increasing honesty or dishonesty from like I did not tell the truth at all the way down to I told all of the truth. Evaluation item is an indication of whether they thought it was okay or morally right to lie or to tell the truth. And then a motivation item tries to capture how important it was that the truth be known, that the truth be told. All right, so with our 6-item scale, we then went to do some confirmatory work in more daily life setting than just sitting down and remembering 10 situations over and over again. That's a good start, definitely not daily life. So we did an experience sampling study that participants completed over 3 weeks, in which they twice a day reported on a situation that had occurred since the last report, where someone, definitely not our virtuous participants, but somebody might have been tempted to lie in that situation. We're not going to say who. And within each of these reports, participants completed among information about what the situation was they found themselves in, they completed this state truthfulness scale, indicating how truthful they were. We saw that the factor structure held up really nicely. These items all held together, even taking them out of the somewhat artificial initial validation we did with them. They held up well in a day-to-day setting. And just a couple psychometric notes that came out of this that give us confidence in this measure. We saw substantial but not overwhelming variability in these state measures. So that is, people varied quite a bit in how honest they were from minute to minute, but it's not random. It's not that there's no visible individual differences. People differed on it, but people differed even within themselves from day to day. And then to kind of come full circle on these state measures, I said it's important that we think that the states are the manifestations of this trait that we've spent all this time measuring. What we did is we wanted to compare whether that trait measure predicts what should be a measure of its manifestations. And so we used trait scores collected ahead of the ESM period to predict each person's average state truthfulness score over that 3-week period. And it turns out that the trait measure was highly correlated with this aggregate state measure over that 3-week period. That correlation of 0.55 is comparable to similar analyses for Big 5 states and traits, so which we take to show that the relationship between this state and trait versions of the TCS is at least as good as well-established personality measures. Sorry. All right, so to put that all in a single spot, we have now our 6-item state measure that shows really good internal consistency. It covers a lot of the content that we wanted going into this whole process. It was developed across a range of situations, which hopefully means that it can travel to more situations. And we see evidence of that in the fact that this measure seems to work well in our ESM study. And then finally, the evidence that this correlates well with our trait measure seems to be pretty strong evidence that this is, in fact, picking up meaningful scores on how truthful people are in their day-to-day life. So this seems to be picking up what we want it to pick up. All right, so that's development of trait and state so far. And I just want to wrap by kind of gesturing at some of the things that we are doing with this now. So this is a lot of work. There's a lot of time in the assessment process in building that up. And we're just putting a bow on collection for some of the big studies that employ these new measures to really learn some big substantive things about state honesty, or about state and trait honesty. So I just want to briefly mention to you some of the things that we're exploring within that. So one example of something we're looking at in it is looking at different situations and which sorts of situations, just kind of at a flat level, seem to pull for more honesty or seem to result in more variability in truthfulness. So these are results from that first recollection study I had at the very beginning of the state stuff, where participants rated their truthfulness in each of these sorts of situations. And what we can see is, perhaps unsurprisingly, that different situations seem to result in different mean levels of truthfulness. But you also see pretty substantial variation in variation in the variation, I suppose. So something like avoiding blame, avoiding doing something, getting out of a conversation you don't want to be in. People reported being less honest in those than in something more mundane like explaining instructions or coordinating with other people. Other directions that we're working on with this is looking at expectancy values for truthfulness. What do people expect to get out of being honest, being dishonest in the moment? And how does that align with the situations that they find themselves in to predict how truthful people are ultimately being in day-to-day life? And then finally, we've also recently wrapped collection on a shorter ESM study looking at the goals that people are pursuing. What is it that people are trying to achieve in these situations they find themselves in, and which of these kinds of goals are more strongly related to more higher or lower truthfulness? What pulls us in, what things are we trying to accomplish that pull for honesty, that pull for dishonesty? And without good state measures like the ones that we've tried to develop here, these aren't things that we can meaningfully address. So given this validation work, given these measures that we've developed, we think we now have some of the tools we need to really enable high quality study of the different situations, the different goals, the different expectations we have that pull us to higher and lower levels of honesty. So I want to thank you all for coming. It's been great to host you out here for this conference, and I want to thank again our graduate students for making this possible and John Templeton for funding it.
So technically, we're actually at time, but since I'm the organizer, I get to break the rules, I guess. We're going to go longer. So at this point, I may also prioritize some who haven't had as much chance, but I see 3, so we'll go 1, 2, 3. Start us off.
So I thought the trait-state correlations were interesting. It was 0.23 with the face valid honesty item I wrote down and 0.55 with the new measure. And so trying to kind of make sense of those, and I was actually curious if you were able to test how honesty, humility, which I agree is not a measure of honesty, but is, I'd say, a pretty good measure of character more generally. That's how I've always thought of it. And so I don't know if you have that or be able to test, because think how well would honesty, humility predict that state honesty in those samples versus your new trait measure. Presumably your new trait measure should be stronger, but I'd be surprised if you didn't also get some correlations, and maybe you looked at that.
We had the hexagon, right?
We have the at least honesty, humility in each of these studies. We haven't looked at that particular point. I would expect and be concerned if it wasn't the case that the trait truthfulness predicts at least the truthfulness one, at least the state truthfulness better than does the hexagon. Did that make sense?
That second study, if you have a 0.55 correlation, I think it'd be interesting to say, well, honesty, humility would correlate 0.3. It gives you a sense of how much better you're
Yes.
Right,
going.
yeah. That would be an important issue for the discriminant validity.
Yeah.
It's not,
Exactly.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, we have some data to get at that, at least.
Yeah, we haven't looked at it yet, but we haven't looked at that particular relationship, but it's in there, and we can definitely do that.
My question's mostly for Philip. So, just because of where you were in the presentation, but so you mentioned a little bit about the variation between versus within people, and so I'm curious if you looked at like interclass correlations or anything like that in terms of do you actually see more variation within people in honesty or between people?
Yeah. So in Short answer, yes, we looked at the interclass correlations. That's what I'm relying on for that. And it was split pretty much down the middle. Half the variance in state reports was between people, half the variance was within.
I was curious about the situation study that you run, because reading the situational labels, they really look like goals already.
They really look like goals, you said?
Yes. I mean, avoid doing something, or I don't remember if you can go back a couple of slides. Avoid playing, avoid doing something, or explaining some instruction. This doesn't look like something that happens to you, but something that activates some goals, specific goals, impressing someone, etc. So
yeah, I think that's right, and that's something that definitely came up in trying to come up with these. Was we naturally fall into goal talk when it's like, okay, well, what kinds of things could we do? You very naturally fall into goal talk, right? But yeah, these definitely I don't think are something utterly distinct from. I think they're very goal-laden context. Kind of, have you been in situations where you had a particular goal? Might be another way to think of that study. Yeah.
We did consider other types of ways of conceptualizing situations, like the captions model or the diamonds model, and we did that in an early version or an early study that wasn't using the state TS or something, and there just was no action. Like negative situations, it's just so broad that it's like, okay, do you lie more or less in negative situations, or in the diamonds, one of them was in deception situations. Like, well, okay, I think we might be able to guess what we're going to. So yeah, we thought about some of those ways of conceptualizing situations, and we did try that once, and it was kind of not action, and it didn't even seem kind of that interesting at that point. So I started thinking ways of conceptualizing situations that might be more relevant and have more action with regard to honesty. But you're absolutely right. These ways of conceptualizing situation are kind of situations in which this was your primary goal. Yeah, for sure.
I agree that it's very difficult to assess situations in a meaningful way other than very, very broad domains. One is deception, so that would take 95% of what's going on.
Exactly. I think we had exactly the discussion. We discussed all these taxonomies, and with the diamonds, we're like, oh, looks like only one situation is relevant here. So.
Yes, I completely agree with the way they talk about the conceptual and content validity of the problems of the honesty humility scale. But I think they would also agree that the honesty humility scale is nonetheless the best existing predictor of individual differences in honesty, of telling the truth in daily life and in situations, experimental games, and so on. So it's actually, even though it doesn't mention honesty anywhere, it does predict whether people are honest or not, which is an interesting puzzle. It's still, their measure is going to be a better predictor of honesty in situations than is honesty and humility. It's an improvement over that. But even though it conceptually had these problems, it was still predicting honesty, which is an interesting fact about the possibly connected to, and all clusters can tell me how this makes no sense, but possibly connected to the unity of the virtues, maybe? I don't know, is that really ridiculous? Okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, I think I would think of the honesty humility as kind of, as we talked about earlier, kind of measuring a very broad construct, whether it's benevolence or moral character, something, just a broad construct that even though some of the items like on the hexaco, don't explicitly mention truthfulness or truth-telling or whatever, it measures something that is correlated with tendency to be truthful. Yeah. So it's at least an indirect measure of truthfulness. It's measure something broader and related. Yeah. So I agree with that, but our hope is, and going back to the point about discriminant validity, that this will be a more precise measure of the specific component of that broader construct. The data will tell us whether that's true, but that's our intention at least.
Can I ask one quick thing? So could you say a little bit more about those affective items? I was quite curious about they're showing up in the trait measure, but then they drop from the state.
Yeah. Pull up the trait measure here. So we might not be able to read it from there, but some of the affective items on the trait measure are about kind of your general tendency if you were to lie. So kind of conditional, hypothetical, were you to lie. If I were to successfully lie or mislead someone intentionally, I would feel guilty. So there's this sort of hypothetical component to the affective items in the trait measure. Problem is that that's a general statement about how I tend to feel in general. In the state measure, when we try to import that, you're now having to make a specific hypothetical about if I were to have lied in this situation, which I may or may not have, I would have then felt guilty. So there's like 3 layers of prediction that a participant is doing with that kind of an item. And we went round and round with the affective items, trying to get them worked into ways that were less of this contingent or hypothetical way, and we really were unsuccessful in coming up with anything that psychometrically held up with the rest of it. They all just kind of floated in the ether of the factor analysis, so to speak.
We did consider having items like, in this situation, I felt guilty. But that's not a measure of truthfulness, right? That's a measure of feeling guilt, which I could measure for any reason. And so that goes back to just a general statement about tendency, feeling that particular emotion in that situation is not going to get us truthfulness. And so that's where the conditional part comes in. It's like, and the items specialize feeling this particular emotion in a particular, or having done a particular thing. Mm-hmm. So in a state situation, like what if a person hadn't done that thing? Then you say, well, that's where it got weird. And so we felt like it made sense to kind of just exclude that for purposes of this going forward, and we'll give that more thought. But yeah, the other items were not as conditional in that way. And so it's very clear. In this situation, I did this, I thought this, I wanted this. So, yeah.
Can I ask a question about your procedure for developing the state scale following having already developed the trait scale? It's kind of a general question, really. It's like, well, people do this sort of thing. One way that you can do it is like, well, I've got my items for the trait scale, so let me just rewrite them a little bit so that they'll apply to the specific situation. But you didn't do that. You had like a much more rigorous procedure, and so I'm wondering what led you to do that. Is there some evidence you're relying on that says that your approach leads to better measures than the simpler approach?
I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Caleb. And would you like to take this, or you want to? I'm just jumping in.
I'll clarify the procedure, and then you can speak to
okay, thank you.
whether it's a good idea.
Sorry about that.
So the idea was to start from here and start from, okay, we have these components that we're focused on. We have these ways of assessing them at a trait level. So let's take second item here. In some situations, it's okay to tell a lie. So this is an evaluation. It is sometimes morally okay to tell a lie, right? As a general trait statement. In the specific situation, a very natural translation of that would be something like, in this situation, it was okay to tell a lie, and gradations thereof. So what we did procedurally was take these items and see which ones we could make into a sort of situation version, like I just did there with the lying. And we would do several different sort of riffing on, let's say you take that item, you do 2 or 3 different items at a state level that try to get at that, because that subtle wording can make a difference sometimes, right? It can make it easier, harder, clearer, more murky of an item. So we do several different variants of that, still always keeping in mind that we want to bring all of the components with us. So we then have several clusters of component items that are related to what was on here, but not necessarily a one-for-one translation. Does that clarify that? And then, was that a good idea?
Better than I would have done, yeah.
So I'll just quickly follow up. So as you can see, there's some items that are like white lies or something's okay, right? That probably wouldn't translate very well into a state measure, right? So the goal when you're thinking about the items in a state measure is that you're able to capture what you think are the key features of truthful communication in that moment. Now, a few years ago, we developed a measure of intellectual humility that we intentionally developed to be used as a state measure or trait measure, right? Actually, Alan was very helpful in giving advice on the core features of intellectual humility. But there, we intentionally wrote the item so that it could be given either as a state measure or trait measure, right? But because some of these items, right, like some of the items on top, don't lend themselves as easily, right? It was important for us to like systematically go through and ensure that the items we're picking were doing a good job at capturing people's momentary manifestations of honesty.
Great, let's thank our speakers.